Can you imagine a country losing almost 8 million people in just a decade? It sounds like a story out of an apocalyptic movie, but it's the harsh reality in Venezuela. It may sound like a lie, but it's the naked reality. A place that has gone from luxury to trash at frightening speed. But the big question is, what happened? How did a territory so rich in natural resources and culture get to this point? How do those who don't appear in the news live? So get ready, because today Bello Mundo is going to take you on an unfiltered dive, exploring behind the scenes of the terror experienced in Venezuela. A journey through a country that is an example of both natural wealth and human desperation. Number 1. Location and geography. Venezuela, located in the northern part of South America, is a territory that mixes stunning natural beauty with a shocking reality. With its borders touching Brazil, Colombia, and Guyana, and a coastline washed by the Caribbean Sea, the country is home to everything from paradisiacal beaches, such as those of the Los Roques archipelago, to the imposing Andes mountain range and the world's largest waterfall, the Salto Ángel. But behind this postcard scenery, the story is quite different. While the landscapes enchant tourists, much of the population struggles with poor infrastructure and extreme poverty that seems to have no end. The capital, Caracas, is a perfect portrait of this contrast. On the one hand, wealthy neighborhoods boast mansions, shopping malls, and sophisticated restaurants. On the other, poor communities suffer from violence, a lack of basic services, and a supply that, most of the time, is a real challenge, and that's exactly where we're going today. But first, let's talk about them. Those affected, the Venezuelan people. Number 2. People and culture. If there's one thing the Venezuelan people haven't lost, even in the midst of chaos, it's their resilience. Known for their human warmth, Venezuelans keep their smiles on their faces and their creativity in everyday life. It's common to see people improvising repairs, opening informal businesses, or selling food on the streets to try to make ends meet. The cuisine, full of flavor, is still a way of reconnecting with one's roots. Anyone visiting the country should try the famous arepa, stuffed with cheese or macada meat, and the pabellón criollo, a dish that combines rice, black beans, shredded meat, and fried plantain. In popular neighborhoods, it's common to see people gathered together playing dominoes, listening to reggaeton, and sharing stories while trying to forget, even for a moment, the daily challenges. But the less talked about side of this story is painful. Long queues for food, dependence on donations from relatives who have migrated abroad, and shortages of basic items such as medicines and hygiene products are a reality that millions face on a daily basis. Number 3. History. In recent years, the situation in Venezuela has deteriorated dramatically. Extreme poverty, the mass flight of citizens, and the lack of basic items such as medicines, hygiene products, and even food dominate the news about the country. The UN estimates that around 7 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. The situation is so critical that many Venezuelans depend on the black market to survive, while the minimum wage is barely $5. And just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, in 2020, the global pandemic made the crisis even worse. The lack of tests, the government's lack of transparency, and the repression of health professionals who tried to disclose information prevented the country from receiving the necessary aid. Without reliable data, the crisis in Venezuela did not receive the attention it deserved. With medical supplies already scarce before the pandemic, the health crisis has only intensified the population's desperation. It may be hard to believe, but it wasn't always like this. What many may not know is that Venezuela, not so long ago, was a thriving democracy and the richest in Latin America. There was a time when the country was known as the richest nation in Latin America. During the 20th century, the oil boom turned the country into an investment center. Caracas was a vibrant city with modern infrastructure, an efficient metro network, and shopping malls that symbolized the height of consumerism in the region. However, all this wealth was built on unstable foundations. Almost total dependence on oil left the economy vulnerable to any fluctuation in the price of a barrel. When Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, he promised to change the game, fight corruption, and distribute wealth more fairly. And for a brief period, it seemed to work. With oil prices on the rise, the government implemented social programs and nationalized several companies. But when the price of oil plummeted, the Venezuelan economy spiraled into chaos. Under the leadership of Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's successor, the situation collapsed even further. Rampant inflation, shortages of basic products, political repression, and allegations of electoral fraud have become routine. Millions of Venezuelans have left the country in search of a more dignified future, while those who remain face a daily struggle for survival. You don't have to be an expert to realize that the situation is critical, and the cow is really going down the drain. Number 4. Poverty and scarcity. For those who live abroad, it's hard to imagine the routine of a Venezuelan who needs to ensure food on the table. Over the years, access to essential products has become increasingly difficult. Day-to-day life for many Venezuelans comes down to trying to keep food on the table. According to a United Nations report, in April of one year, the minimum wage amounted to just $5 a month, covering less than 5% of the cost of the basic food basket. In certain regions, entire families have been forced to exchange personal belongings for food. There are those who are willing to provide domestic services or even sexual favors in exchange for food. This kind of desperation shows how critical the crisis has become. In addition, a United Nations report pointed out that many Venezuelans spend around 10 hours a day queuing for food. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Women report that they sometimes have to choose between buying intimate hygiene products or something to eat. Those who don't have access to foreign currency face even more difficulties, as the bolivar, the local currency, depreciates rapidly and has no purchasing power. This situation generates a cycle of informality. People set up stalls in front of their homes to sell any item they can to try to survive the economic chaos. Number 5. Lack of infrastructure and blackouts. If food shortages weren't enough already, the failures in public services are another major torment for the population. Many neighborhoods in the capital, Caracas, go without running water for weeks at a time. Residents report having to stock up on rainwater or pay for water trucks, which charge very high prices. Public transport has also collapsed in various parts of the country. Old, poorly maintained buses keep breaking down in the middle of the route, causing inconvenience and delays for workers who already face very heavy routines. Those who live further away, especially in the countryside, suffer even more, as there is less transport available, and the roads have potholes and precarious bridges. However, nothing illustrates the chaos as well as the frequent power blackouts that hit large parts of the country. In 2019, for example, there was a sequence of national blackouts that left millions of people in the dark, without communication and without access to basic necessities. Hospitals were left without generators, which compromised the functioning of machines and even caused deaths that could have been avoided. Supermarkets lost food that required refrigeration, making the shortages even worse. According to UN figures, more than 40 people died in hospitals during this period alone due to the lack of power to vital equipment. Despite government promises to improve the situation, blackouts continue, especially in states like Zulia, where residents have gone up to 24 hours without power, repeatedly during the week. This problem is the result of years of lack of investment in maintenance and modernization of the electricity system. Number 6. Health and education. Venezuela's public health crisis doesn't seem real because it's so tragic. Imagine hospitals running out of medicine, basic equipment, and often without electricity. Between November 2018 and February 2019, the UN counted more than 1,500 deaths due to the simple lack of essential medical supplies. During the blackouts of March 2019, another 40 deaths occurred because there was no power in the hospitals. The situation is so serious that in many cities, including Caracas, there is a staggering 100% shortage of medicines. There's no vaccine, no antibiotics, not even gloves or gauze for the doctors. Patients have to bring their own medicines, sheets, and even lamps to light their rooms. In education, the story is not very different. Teachers, receiving salaries so low that they can barely afford to buy food, are leaving the classroom in droves. Many prefer to take their chances in informal jobs or simply leave the country. Public schools face a chronic shortage of basic supplies, and classes are constantly interrupted for lack of electricity or water. In some regions, students abandon their studies to help their families survive, either by scavenging for food or working in any service possible. And while all this is going on, Nicolas Maduro has a solution. Only it's worthy of a comic book. Literally. It may sound like a lie, but it really does happen. Have you ever heard of Super Mustache? Well, he's a superhero based on Maduro himself, with magical powers coming from his iconic mustache. And we're not talking about metaphors or jokes here. The story of Super Mustache has been transformed into real comic books, distributed to the population as a way of exalting the leader and explaining the country's problems. According to these stories, electricity blackouts are the fault of a mechanical mole that the superhero has to defeat. The lack of vaccines, that's the work of a monster created by the CIA, which only the mustachioed superhero can tackle. And so on. The wife of this peculiar president, not to say dictator, Celia Flores, has also become a hero. Named Celita, she appears alongside Super Mustache, forming a couple of defenders of the nation. Dolls of these characters have been given to children, along with murals and t-shirts with their images all over Caracas. While these bizarre things dominate the official narrative, the population suffers, and anyone who tries to criticize or oppose the government faces even worse consequences. Number 7. Lack of press freedom and censorship. While the country sinks into social problems, the government, led by Nicolas Maduro, controls the narrative with an iron fist, making censorship an indispensable tool to guarantee its stay in power. Anyone who dares to criticize the regime risks their freedom, or worse, their life. In 2018, at least 24 people were arrested for social media posts considered offensive by the government. And the siege doesn't stop there. Reports indicate that in addition to a lack of basic investment in internet infrastructure, there are strategic blockades of websites and platforms that could serve as vehicles for denunciation or protest. Access to networks becomes a dangerous game, where any post can be enough to be targeted by the authorities. The media are also under overwhelming pressure. Newspapers, radio, and TV stations that dare to show the chaos face sanctions, forced closure, or even the imprisonment of their journalists. The message is clear: either follow the official line or be eliminated from the media scene. Number 8. Corruption, persecutions, and explosive leaks. Corruption is the fuel of Venezuelan chaos. Hacker groups such as Anonymous have already leaked documents revealing alleged embezzlement of billions of dollars, up to $400 billion. Meanwhile, the population lives in misery, without medicines, food, or prospects of improvement. But the money embezzled is just the tip of the iceberg. According to the United Nations, more than 5,000 people were killed in resistance to authority in 2018. NGOs point to even more frightening figures, reaching more than 7,000 deaths in the same period. Young people from poor communities, often without any involvement in crime, are executed without any chance of defense. And when they're not killed, they're arrested. Between 2014 and 2019, more than 15,000 people were arrested for political reasons. These arrests included demonstrators, journalists, and even ordinary citizens who dared to take a stand against the regime. Reports detail night raids, with entire families being terrorized. None of this would be possible without the direct action of the Venezuelan Special Action Forces, FAES, known as the Death Squads. Witnesses describe brutal operations. Masked men break into houses, ransack belongings, and separate young people from their families before executing them. They then manipulate the crime scene, planting weapons and drugs to justify the attacks as confrontations. Number 9. The helicoid. Speaking of prisons and repression, fear and inhumanity, there is no place more representative of the terror experienced by the opposition than the dreaded prison called the helicoid. Perhaps there is no greater symbol of political absurdity in Venezuela than this prison, which is more reminiscent of a concentration camp. Conceived in the 50s to be the most modern shopping mall in South America, the spiral-shaped building, located in Caracas, ended up becoming a feared detention center. The spiral-shaped building would have stores, restaurants, and parking for thousands of cars, all to be the most modern in South America. The project, however, was never completed due to a lack of funds. Decades later, this housing has been put to a very different use. Today, the helicoid is controlled by SABIN, Bolivarian Intelligence Service, and functions as a prison that frightens even the bravest. The place has become a human warehouse for opponents, journalists, and any citizen who in any way displeases the government of Nicolás Maduro, also known as Mr. Mustache. According to human rights organizations, the scene inside the helicoid is terrifying. Overcrowded cells, cockroach infestation, lack of light and water, and reports of physical and psychological torture make up the day-to-day life in this prison. Former inmates have described the experience as hell on earth, and it's not hard to imagine why. Screams of beatings echo through the corridors, and the feeling of despair is as concrete as the walls of this place. In 2018, the situation came to international attention. An American prisoner managed to clandestinely record a video inside the helicoid, denouncing the inhumane conditions. The ensuing riot attracted worldwide attention, and external pressure secured his release. But for the Venezuelans who remain there, the routine of fear, torture, and abandonment continues as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Nicolás Maduro insists on defending the helicoid as a moral reference. Contradictory, isn't it? The leader of one of Latin America's most authoritarian regimes, famous for persecuting opponents, torturing those who disagree with his ideas, and plunging the country into chaos, proclaims himself the guardian of morals and good manners. It's almost comical if it weren't so tragic. And so we end another journey, this time exploring the backstage of Venezuela. Now I want to know, what surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind destinations that are considered perfect, keep following Bello Mundo. We still have lots of surprising stories and secrets that nobody tells you to explore together. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.